Hi, this is Dawn Summers. Welcome back to my fashion studio. Today we're going to talk about a very important topic of seam finishes. And most people think seam finishes, what is that or why is it important? But in the apparel industry, it is incredibly important to understand what the seam finishes are and what their technique is so that you know costing behind them, price point behind them, because at this point we're starting to look at items and garments for their cost and what they are doing in the industry. So one thing I want to talk about first of all is what is a seam finish? So a seam finish is finishing the inside of the seam that you just sewed. So the seam finish is raw, it's open, and we need to cover it so that it won't unravel with wear or with washing. So those are the main reasons that we're covering the seam with the seam finish. The way we decide what kind of seam finish to use is we're looking at the fiber content, what kind of fiber are we using, what kind of finish needs to be used on certain fibers, and also what is the end use of the garment. Is it a heavy use garment? Is it not used very often? What kind of finish do we need to use based on the weave and the finish of the garment, or what the garment actually is. So learning the proper technique for these different finishes is important. It's important to be able to look at them and identify them. And if you don't know how to do them, you're not going to be able to figure out what they are when you look at them. Also, price point. We're going to kind of start talking about a lot about industry stuff in my videos from now on. And when we're talking about putting an item together or a garment together, you have to know a price point because you have to stay within reason or within a certain boundary, or your garment will cost too much. And you also need to know what these different finishes are so that when you're looking at something, you will understand the price point as well. I'm going to give you some examples here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the three areas of the fashion industry and world, mainly in the different careers. So when you talk about or think about a career, you can be in the design side, where you can be a designer, assistant designer, a lot of things that encompass that career. You can also be in the technical design world, which is kind of like the garment engineer, trying to figure out what all the different techniques for the whole garment are used. Under that umbrella is also in production. So learning about what needs to be on a garment to make it go through the production line. That falls under the technical design umbrella. Finally, you could be in the selling of the garment. So that can be the merchandiser, the actual buyer of a garment for a store. It can be a retailer, anybody that is on the side of selling the garment. So we have those three things we're going to look at. Now, as we think about what kind of seam finish, why does each of those different jobs, careers, need to understand what the correct seam finish would need to be? So if I was a designer and I was designing something, I would need to know what seam finish was appropriate for that so that when it moved on to the next stage, I was able to sew in a sample the correct seam finish. So when it moved on to the next stage, they would know what I wanted and what the intent was. If I was a technical designer, I need to know the correct seam finish so that it can go through the production line, and I know the cost of these different seam finishes. So it's important as the technical designer or the production person, all under that umbrella of knowing and understanding seam finishes and knowing how they work, how you do them. Finally, thinking of a seam finish from the perspective of the retailer, the merchandiser, or the buyer, you're thinking, why do I need to know and understand a seam finish? I'm only buying them, or I'm only selling them. So from that perspective, if you know what seam finish is appropriate for a garment, when you're buying it or you're at a market and you're buying these different items for your store, you can look at them and you know what to expect. You know what is quality and you know what is not top quality. You know the price point of it's cheaper to do an overlock versus a French seam or a flat felled seam, and you know how to do those techniques. So stepping back a little bit, and we've been learning a lot about sewing and sewing techniques. All three of those careers and everything that is under their umbrella, you need to know how to sew. That way you can be really good at what you do. Don't just know a little bit, but know a lot of stuff. I'm going to give you an example here, and then we'll move on to learning these techniques in person. So I have 2 blouses here, and the first blouse has just an overlock seam finish. So they stitched the seam and did an overlock over the edge to protect it from wear and laundering. It's holding up really well. This is my blouse. I wear it a lot. And you can see it's starting to fray there a little bit, but it's holding up really well. That is an overlock. This is the most inexpensive finish that goes through the production line. Now, if we move over to this little blouse, you can see it's a really nice seam finish. It's clean, it's not an overlock. This is called a French seam. You can see how nice that looks. Okay, so a French seam is a technique that you use on a lightweight garment, usually a silk. This is a little silk blouse, and you can see that this seam finish is not only holding up well, but it looks clean and finished and nice. It costs more to do this technique because it has more steps to it. When a garment goes through the production line, it goes through different modules where this seam is completed and maybe even the overlock in one step. This particular seam goes through at least 2 steps, possibly even 3 depending on the equipment. So this is going to cost more than the one that just has 1 or 2 techniques to it, or 1 or 2 processes. But if I was a buyer and I was wanting to buy this particular blouse, so if I went into a market and I found a cute little silk blouse and it had an overlock seam on it. So let's say that this had an overlock just like, or a serged edge just like this blouse. And let's say the cost, I'm just making this up, let's say the cost was $50 for me to buy this blouse for my store. That's pretty high, but we're just playing. So $50 for a silk blouse with an overlock seam. Then down the road or down the aisle, there's another silk blouse that has a French seam, which is the proper seam finish for this, and you know it costs more to do this seam, and it makes it look really nice. That blouse also costs $50. So what am I as the buyer? What would I be more, what would be a better profit margin for me? What would be a better sell for me to purchase for my store? The one with the higher quality, and they're the same price. So somebody with the overlock seam overpriced their garment. Now, if you go into the store, especially in the summer where there's a lot of cute little tops, if you look at their seam finish and they have an overlock seam, the price point or the selling price point is probably pretty low, especially depending on what the materials are. So look at those kind of things when you shop. So it's going to make you a better buyer also knowing these different seam finishes. But working in the industry, the designer needs to know these finishes and how to do them, not just recognize them, but know how they go together. The technical people with the production, of course, that's their main job and need to know that. But finally, you guys that are buyers or retailers or in the marketing side, know your stuff. Learn how to do this and be really good at what you do. Okay, so we're going to pause and learn some of these techniques, and then when we come back, I'm going to show you how to put your technique notebook together so you will always have the information that you need. Okay, we'll see you in just a bit. So the goal with learning all of these seam finishes, whether they're home seam finishes or from the industry, is learning them and having a book to refer back to, because you're not always going to remember, how did I do that? So having a book. So I'm going to show you what I've done. I'm creating a techniques notebook, and in the classroom you can do a lot of fun things with this. You can create, the kids can get very creative and make their own, but a techniques notebook. And in my notebook I have some tutorials that I've already done with you guys, which is some hand stitching. So I've put what the stitches are and what their use is for. I've used cardstock, a heavy cardstock, and with this one I've used black just because I thought it was cool and wrote with a contrasting marker. So I have all of my tutorials, my hand stitching tutorials in here, and then sewing on a button, and then today here's our home sewing techniques of the seam finish, the pinked edge. And so we just went through all of these today that you can watch in today's tutorials. And when we get to the industry techniques, I wrote down there it's industry techniques. You can also add some more steps for your students by what kind of fabrics, what is this seam finish used for? So you can have a lot of information on here. But you'll have everything in reference and able to refer back to it very easily. And we'll keep adding to this notebook as we learn more techniques of all kinds of different things. But this can be for a student that can go home with them and use that for forever. But a fun way to keep everything that you're learning together. So until next time, please keep watching my tutorials. Watch me on YouTube channel as well, Dawn Summers Fashion Studio. And please share it with your friends so everybody can have some of these great tutorials in their classroom. All right, thank you and have a great day.